Master Your Mindset Radio, episode 100.
Welcome to Master Your Mindset Radio, the show where we empower you to discover your true self before the world told you differently. Now for your host, Elizabeth Nader.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the 100th episode of Master Your Mindset Radio. I am excited to have you here and really excited to be at episode 100. I love it when consistency exists in my life. I like to be dedicated to things, and I always encourage you to as well. So I'm going to celebrate 100 episodes. I think that it's an amazing milestone. I have so many more to go, but just to think that I've been able to talk to my audience 100 times, one time a week for the past 100 weeks with encouragement and stories and interviews. It just makes me feel really great. So don't mind if I sing my own praises a little bit, but I do encourage you to go after those goals yourself and be consistent, because that's when it happens. So today I'm going to bring you actually a friend of mine, somebody who I admire, who I have watched do some pretty incredible things, who has a story that you will be amazed at and really is something I believe will encourage you no matter what you face in your life. So I want to welcome to the 100th episode of Master Your Mindset Radio, Phil Rizzo. Welcome.
Hi, Elizabeth. Congratulations on 100 episodes. And I just want to congratulate you on being in good company. I mean, I'm honored to be on this special occasion of your 100th show, but you're in good company because I was born in 1976. And America has the blessing of having me be born on the bicentennial. And so you're in really good company, and I'm just glad to be here today.
Perfect. Well, you're a patriot, so I love that there's a 76 in your birthday. That makes a lot of sense to me. I am going to have you tell your story, but for those people who aren't sure who you are, and they would likely not be New Jerseyans, because I think at this point, most people in New Jersey have heard of you, seen your sign, we'll tell why in a minute, or in some way know the name Phil Rizzo. But to my audience, Phil is a family man, an entrepreneur, businessman, a pastor, a recent candidate for elected office. We'll tell that story as well. But really a man who has defied quite a few odds and has been able to overcome things that may have stopped other people. And that is the essence really of today's show and of his story. So we are going to go back to 1976. We have to start from the beginning. And Phil, that's when you were born. So first 4 years of your life, I'm assuming there's not much to tell. Great family. You have an older sister, grew up in New Jersey. All was well the first 4 years. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we had some really big moments, my first words, my first steps, but all kidding aside, yeah, the first 4 years of my life, I think would fall into the normal category. Mom and dad at home, older sister, just two kids. I think we had a dog or two. So yeah, up until four, we'd say everything was pretty much normal and on pace to set off in life.
So 4 years later, it's 1980. Take us through in detail the story of what happened to you that year.
In 1980, we moved out of our current home, and we moved into a new home. And it was in Morris County, New Jersey. And uh, we were settled in. We were in the house maybe 6 months. And I was 4, and my sister was 7 years old. She had a friend over. And what we would do in the wintertime, it was too cold to be outside. It was in December. And so we took advantage of the basement floor. We had an indoor roller rink, and basically it means it was just an unfinished basement, and we were roller skating on the concrete slab. But just like many of your listeners probably remember doing that when they were little, roller skating on the basement floor, we were swinging around the columns, the lolly columns that were in the basement. And one of them was loose, and as we were swinging around them, one of them fell down. And when it fell, it hit my arm. And when I fell to the ground, the column landed on my arm, and the weight of it, it's a 6-inch steel column, filled solid with concrete. The weight of that on a 4-year-old, it was just too much, and it crushed the bone in my arm
Mm.
and the artery, bringing the blood to the lower half of my arm. And so after a week of trying, 4 to 6 days of trying to get that blood flow, ultimately at 4 years old, they were left with no option but to amputate my right arm, right at the elbow. Um,
Phil, do you remember the moment it happened? Is it one of those situations where it's all just very clear to you, or is it a bit blurry? I mean, do you remember it? Do you feel it? Can you go back to that moment?
Yeah, I would say at 4, as much as anybody can remember 4, I would say that that day, that moment was as clear as anybody could remember at 4. I remember roller skating. I remember being there, and um, I remember the noise. It wasn't very, very loud, but I do remember hearing it. I don't know if it was just the sound of the pole on the concrete, or if it was my sister screaming, or there was a sound, and it didn't last very long. And then the next thing I remember was seeing my dad come down the basement stairs, and picking up the pole and pulling me out, and then carrying me up the basement stairs to the car, as we headed to the hospital for X-rays. So yeah, I would say it was pretty clear. I do remember there was no pain. I don't remember pain,
Mm.
but I do remember some sounds, and I remember seeing who all was there.
Where that column fell, I mean, those columns are heavy and falling with force. Had it fallen closer to your chest area, could it have killed you or it caused even more damage? I would imagine.
Absolutely. Those columns, they come in 4 inches, and they come in 6 inches. This was a 6 inch, and as I said, they're filled solid with concrete. And yeah, if that landed on my chest, or on my head,
Yeah.
it's game over.
Right.
And as at 4 years old, the distance between your elbow and your head, there's not much. There's not
Wow.
much there.
Wow.
About 18 inches, and so God was certainly gracious to me in that moment, that it just landed on my arm, just the end of my
Yeah.
arm. And so certainly I do recognize that.
That in itself, of course, is a miracle. Nothing is a coincidence or nothing is random. So we know that you were spared in that regard. But now you're at the hospital, and this is 1980. And I've heard you say before that had that accident happened today, perhaps the outcome would be different just based on their skills. But at that point, they're trying to figure out what to do, how to save your arm. And I'm imagining there's a flurry of activity around you. How scared are you at 4 years old, or were you in a bit of shock?
I would say once I was in the hospital, things were a little bit more blurry. I don't know if they were trying to do certain things to get the blood flow in and out of some procedures, if you will, that did not work. And so I was in and out of different procedures. And so I would say that the first few days that I was in the hospital in Dover, at Dover General, um, were more blurry. I do remember at that point seeing my mom. My mom was not home when the accident happened. So the first time I saw my mom was at the hospital. And then not knowing the things that were working and things that were not working, the decision was made that I needed to go to New York. And
Mm.
so the next thing I remember was waking up in a helicopter, and I was flying to New York City on New Year's Eve to have the surgery that ultimately, was the amputation.
Now, your parents are people of faith. How are they talking to you, dealing with this whole time where it's an unknown outcome, but it doesn't seem to be getting better? It's not seeming as though the arm can be saved. How are they talking to you? How are they dealing with this? What did they tell you afterwards?
Well, it was certainly a thing that I know that they were praying about. I think always anticipating a good outcome, even though things were not working. I think that they were optimistic and prayerful right up to the moment when the doctors basically said, "There's nothing else. that could be done. And so they never shared any of those thoughts with me at just 4 years old. I only remember positive things. And like I said, even when I remember opening my eyes and realized I was in a helicopter, I didn't even know why.
Mm,
There was somebody in the helicopter. He was actually a deacon in our church. And so when I opened my eyes, the first person I saw was a familiar face, and he was a police officer. And so they let him ride in that helicopter with me. So that was comforting that I
yeah.
that I saw somebody that I knew. And at that point, he said, "We're just going from one hospital to the other. Everything will be fine." And I just remember it was one of those military helicopters with the double propeller on the top,
Mm,
and the door was opened. And in December, I just remember it being freezing cold inside
mm.
that helicopter, but certainly had somebody there that I knew, and it was as far as I knew, it was just a transport. I didn't know what I was heading to.
So this all unfolds for you obviously more slowly than your parents because they have to figure out how to tell you eventually what the outcome is. How do you tell a 4-year-old you've lost your arm and we need to take it off? There is no hope. How do parents tell their son that? Do you remember how it was said to you?
No, I remember post surgery, the explanation of what was done, because obviously I was heavily bandaged. And I remember, realizing what had happened, and their explanation as to the crush and the bone and the artery, just the damage that was done, and that this is what needed to be done for me to be alive, really, because as the blood was not going to the lower half of my arm, if that blood had to go somewhere, and if that
Mm,
blood went into my heart or into my brain, it could have killed me for not having dealt with it. And so
yeah.
they were really out of options. It was somewhat time sensitive. And so the amputation was not just because the arm couldn't be saved, but because it could have killed me as that blood continued to back up into my
Wow.
body.
Wow. And there were other things they had to do as well, using muscles from your back or something like that, right? It wasn't just a simple amputation. Wasn't there more involved?
Yeah, there was other things that they did prior to the amputation. They tried using some veins from my leg to replace the crushed artery. When the amputation happened, they did a lat flap over. So they took a part of my lat muscle in my back, which they put in my arm. And so um, your bones need protection,
Mhm.
and muscle protects your bones. And so, without having an elbow, there is no, like, if you picture, working out to work your biceps and your triceps. There's only one way to do it. It's to bend your arm and straighten your arm. Well, without an elbow, the bicep and tricep would be gone. And so they
Yeah.
did it with my lat muscle, and so it was, yeah, it was a much more in-depth surgery than a simple amputation.
Amazing. Oh, wow. So you're in the hospital for quite a while, I would think. How long were you there?
Yeah, it was a couple weeks. There was some recovery. They wanted to make sure that there was no infections, obviously, and I needed to make sure that I could move and I wasn't in any sort of pain. And I left the hospital a couple weeks later with some screws holding some bones together, and needed some checkups regularly after coming home. But yeah, it was a few weeks recovery time.
So now begins the need to figure out how you do life without one of your arms. How you adjust to that. You're only 4 years old, so what you can figure out is just different than an adult, right? And so what happens now? What do you do? It's physical therapy. How are your parents addressing this with you? Are you getting depressed, frustrated? I'm trying to imagine a 4-year-old in some way conceiving what's happened to him.
Well, one of the stories that I told on the campaign trail, when you run for office, particularly a statewide office, running for governor, I was meeting people basically every single day that had no idea who I was. All they knew is they wanted a change in New Jersey.
Mhm.
Here's a candidate. I might as well meet him.
Yeah.
And so I would really start an introduction with a story that I had told on the campaign trail, and it was all the way back to shortly after I came home from the hospital. I was doing some shopping with my mom, and we were in a toy store, and I had picked up a little stuffed animal. And when my mom realized it, she said, and Philip, put that stuffed animal down. You don't need any more gifts. People have been sending you gifts from around the country. You
Mm,
don't certainly don't need any more stuffed animals. Please just put the stuffed animal down. Let's get what we need, and let's get home. And I had said to my mother, I don't really want to buy the stuffed animal. I just want to hold it as we walk around the store because I don't want people to see the end of my arm. And
right,
so at 4 years old, not being able to comprehend really what all that meant, but certainly at 4 years old, I was aware. I was aware that I was different. I was
right,
aware that I was an amputee. And on some level, I was aware that people were looking at me,
right.
that it was something that they noticed how I was different. And that broke my mother's heart. And my mom
Yeah.
is, as you mentioned, mom and dad were people of faith. And my mom, having heard that, she began to pray that God would heal her son.
Mm,
And obviously, 40 years later, I have to tell the story of the amputation because God did not heal me by regrowing my arm,
right.
but He did heal my heart, and He
Yeah.
did heal and give me victory over that lack of confidence, that uncertainty, that embarrassment, whatever
Right.
all emotional side of things, that was gone. And my mom knows the day that was gone because I came running into the kitchen just a short while after that Toy Story moment. And I said, I want to play baseball this year. And so at
Mm.
that moment, my mom knew that, we were beyond the physical healing, but now God was handling the emotional healing as well. And that spring was my first year of baseball.
And that was what age?
That was still 4 years old. So I turned four in November. The accident happened in December, and then I played baseball that that spring. So I guess I was 4.5.
I mean, that in itself is a miracle that you suddenly decided to put yourself out there. I mean, kids don't like to stick out, right? I mean, they don't want to be different. It's just inherent for most children. They don't want to be different. They don't want to stick out. This is where bullying comes in. Kids make fun of you, kids stare. Children are, of course, unaware often, even when they do that. So you had to have experienced that from your fellow classmates, or were you somehow spared what would seem to me to be obvious bullying that could happen?
Well, back in 1980, there was no such thing as bullying. Certainly, we were not throwing that term around. People would
Yeah.
be unkind, if you will. Bullying is something that exists. We're never going to get rid of it. I know we're in a culture today where parents, they are trying to carry their kids across the finish line every second
Mm,
of every day. Kids aren't allowed to fall down. Kids aren't allowed to get injured. Kids aren't allowed to make their own peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I mean, we
yeah.
are really holding our children's hands way too long.
Mm,
And the idea of bullying, I mean, I dealt with maybe people looking at me or starting to people wouldn't have confidence in me. For the
yeah.
first little bit, as I can remember, you're starting to make kickball teams or whatever. I would be picked last, and
Mhm.
I'd kick last, but you kick a few over everybody's heads, and you start to get picked first. And so
Mhm.
naturally, I have some God-given talent athletically, but you have to grow through those things. And I think my parents not babying me, letting
Mm,
my parents letting me play baseball,
yeah.
letting me be the one-armed kid, letting me strike out. I played by everybody else's rules. I didn't have
Wow.
my own special set of rules. And when you fail, you then learn how to succeed from those failures. Kids are not allowed to fail today. And so
Right.
when you mention bullying, I don't remember it too much. It's kind of just the way kids grew up in the 80s
Yeah.
and before. Everybody has an element that they need to overcome, whatever it may
Right.
be. And it just made me tough,
Yeah.
and it helped shape my personality and character to what it is today, for sure.
You make a really good point because I also don't remember that term from my youth. I remember kids being mean. I remember that sense that, sometimes you felt being picked on. We didn't use that term bullying. But I think that you're right in the sense that had your parents coddled you, had they tried to make special accommodation for you, had they made sure you got the participation trophy, maybe you wouldn't have risen to the occasion. I mean, I know you have a strong personality. Your mom, I've talked to her and she told me you literally were born a fighter. 4 years before the accident, that she knew that's what your spirit was. God obviously knew you needed to be a fighter. But had you experienced this, had you been born in the 2000s, I mean, your life could have been totally different if your parents had not manage the situation this way in society as well. Don't you think it would have been a completely different outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to think that my parents would have done the same thing. I know culturally it is not the same as 1980.
Yeah.
But as I'm raising my kids, I've got four teenagers, and I'm a throwback. The way I'm raising my kids, they're beating me in things now, and they love beating me in sports now. My kids are 18, 17, 16, and 13, and when they win, they know they actually won because, goodness, I didn't care if they were 5 or 6 or 7. I never let them win at anything.
Yeah.
And so when they started to beat me, and my boys, it really started around 15, 16.
Yeah.
Those wins are real because I'm getting older and they're getting stronger. And so they're real now. And so
Yeah.
they've certainly earned it because my parents made me earn it as well.
Well, it's a word to parents when they see their children go through something difficult, to consider how you help them manage that, and to consider where the line is between love, support, encouragement, and frankly, sheltering in a way that doesn't allow the child to learn to overcome. And I would definitely say that you learn to overcome quickly. You learn to overcome, and this became a theme. So you basically start to become a really good athlete. I mean, it wasn't just baseball, right? And I mean, we're talking, everyone imagine now, Phil's missing one arm. He's playing baseball. Let's just start with that sport. And you're pitching. Do I have that right? Weren't you a pitcher at one point?
Yeah, growing up, like I said, you start out one way, and after you perform a little bit, they move you around. And so, of course, I started in right field. That's where the non-athletic kids play. And for all the parents that are listening, you're thinking, "Oh my goodness, my kid's in right field." Yeah. So I started out in right field, but halfway through the season, they move you over to center field. And then I also played first base. And then as I got a little older, once I was in about the fifth, sixth grade, they had me pitching. And
Wow.
so once I got into high school, I continued to play baseball. And my freshman year of high school, I played center field, and I also pitched because I was a lefty. And I batted second on the
Wow.
team, and I led my team in doubles. So that's as a freshman in high school. So yeah, not letting me have special special situations
Yeah.
made me get better against, I'm doing air quotes right now, against quote unquote normal kids.
Right.
I had to elevate my game in order to compete. And that's what struggle does for you. It lets you elevate your skills.
If you choose to allow it to. Now, right, it's a choice. We make a choice every day of how to react to the things that happen to us. I mean, that's where our power center is how we choose to react to what we face. And this wasn't coaches, a situation where coaches were saying, "Oh, let the kid with one arm, be nice to him, make it easy for him. Oh, let's make him feel good." You didn't get any special treatment, right?
I didn't. I have been benched. I have been yelled at. I have been pulled out of games. I was always treated like everybody else, and I'm thankful for it. And I can remember the coaches that I had growing up, and I'm so appreciative of them just treating me like everybody else.
Mm,
I guess technically they could have been afraid to do that, but they weren't. Like I said, 1980s culture was a lot different than today.
yeah.
And I'm thankful that everybody just kept it real. I remember, I'm probably fast forwarding on you, but I did get into high school baseball a little bit. When I got into high school, I stopped playing soccer, and I excelled in soccer, but whatever. I guess you don't need hands in soccer unless you're a
Mm,
goalie, but I excelled in soccer growing up. And when I got into high school, I switched to football, and I
mm,
played 4 years of high school football. And I remember they did a newspaper article on me, and the title of the newspaper article was "Normal in Every Way." And I
mm.
remember being, 17 and in high school being so annoyed at the title of the article. I'm like, by them saying I'm normal in every way,
Yeah,
is saying I'm not normal, right?
yeah, yeah,
And whatever, I'm not, and you know me a little bit. I guess I'm not normal, but I knew what the article was about. But I even remember
yeah,
at 17, normal in every way. I was like,
yeah.
whatever,
They would
cocky
write that about
17-year-old.
somebody else, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right, yeah. But it was a major compliment, obviously. It was a recognition that, your shortcomings, so to speak, didn't need to hold you back or even be talked about, right? But they're celebrating that, and I think you have to remember that people that face other things in their life, when they can look at someone who obviously you can't hide that struggle, right? A lot of people's struggles are hidden, but when it's that obvious and you see someone overcome it, it's really an encouragement, and people like to point that out because that's what encourages all of us to say, if he can do it, I can do it as well. Obviously, God gave you the personality. He gave you the characteristics in your personality to do so. But it wasn't just sports. I mean, you had to learn how to tie your shoes, zip up your jacket, now tie your tie. How do you learn all those things? And didn't you just get frustrated with that?
Yeah, I would say there was an element of frustration. Now, the interesting thing, when you have perspective is so powerful,
Mm,
to the point of, I'm an amputee since I'm 4 years old, and I hear about, teenagers or a 20 or 30-year-old or whatever, ending up in some sort of accident where they become an amputee. I actually feel worse for them because they
mm,
need to relearn things that they already knew how to do, but they need to learn how to do it with one hand. Everything I learned to do, I only had one way to learn it. So for me, as I look back, the perspective was, I guess I didn't realize that I had to work harder than everybody else. I mean, I
huh,
realize it now, but I guess my level of frustration was just that competitive spirit in me. Like,
yeah.
I wanted to accomplish everything the first try, but that just
Yeah.
wasn't, that's just not the reality. And I remember one time, I guess it was kindergarten. I remember them going around the classroom asking kids, "Can you zip your coat?" And oh yeah, everybody's saying yes. And by the time they got to me, I didn't want to be the only kid that didn't know how to tie my
Mhm.
zip my coat. So I'm like, yeah. So everybody said yes. They're like, okay, wonderful. Everybody, tomorrow when you come in, we want to see your zip your coat. I'm like, oh no. I remember I didn't sleep that night. I was in kindergarten. I must have been 5. I stayed up all night teaching myself how to zip a coat.
Oh,
Quite honestly, because I didn't want to get caught in a lie. But
yeah.
yeah, whatever whatever the driving force is, I certainly realized at a very young age, and throughout my life, what is the goal? How do I accomplish it? And I became
Right.
a very goal driven, goal oriented person. Point A to point B, get
Right.
there.
With
And that
yeah.
has really defined my life. And I kind of need a staff to clean up the wake of disastrous mess I leave behind me. But I certainly, if you need somebody to get you from point A to point B, I'm your man.
Yeah, and especially if there's a mountain between point A and point B,
Right.
right? I mean, we're not talking about an easy road. So what is your faith like during all this time? And this is sort of pre-college. You're raised in a family of faith. Of course, each child needs to discover that personal relationship on their own. But what was the faith journey like for you before college? Were you in tune with God? Did you feel close to him?
No, no. Being raised in a Christian home, the Bible was the center of our home. The Bible was the final authority in our house. A lot of people think that that's religious. It's not.
Hmm.
Religion is man's way to get to God. The Bible
Right.
is God's way to get to God. And so
Right.
my parents, being Christians, they relied on the Bible. And so the Bible was the final authority in our house. I remember my mom ending many arguments by saying, Philip, the Bible says, and whatever we were dealing with, that was the end of the conversation. I knew not to argue with the Bible,
Right.
although my relationship with God was not personal. And when I got into high school, I started rebelling against church and going to youth group and, playing high school football, Saturday games. I had really developed a great excuse that I was sore and I was tired on Sundays, and my attendance in church and youth group began to slip through high school. Then went off to college, and now I'm on my own. And
Mm.
college, I would say, definitely moved even further away from what the standard of what Christian living looked like. I mean, I knew it. I guess academically, being raised in a home with the Bible, but in application, I knew that I was moving farther and farther away from it. Being out of the house and really being my own person.
Was there a price that you paid for that? Do you feel as though life would have been different had you found your own path, back to faith rather than just sort of slipping away from what you were raised in? Was there a consequence?
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody knows that's listening to this. Sin leaves scars in your life, and I've heard it said like this, when you talk about words, harsh words, and this isn't just for words. This is for any sin. Every time you say something wrong, you use a harsh word or foul language. Um, Drive a nail into a 2x4, and every time you do something or say something wrong, put another nail in the board. But then when you do something good and you say a kind word, take a nail out. And you have
Mm.
this whole life of nailing nails into the board and pulling them out. At the end of the life, even if you get all the nails out, that board is pretty marred.
Mhm.
And that's life. That's what sin will do in your life. It'll scar you, even though they are gone. It's there. Those elements do remain. And even for those that are Christians that may be listening to this, they know that their relationship with God, those things are gone, and there's healing. But you can remember them, and life
Yeah,
would be different without a lot of those holes.
absolutely. All right, so now we're in college. You are not we. You are in college, and Villanova, getting a business degree. Is that correct?
Yeah, I actually transferred into Villanova my
Okay.
sophomore year. My older sister, as we bring her back from 1980, my
Hmm.
older sister had gone to Villanova, and the trailblazer that I did not want to go to Villanova because I didn't want to go where my sister went.
Mm,
And so I wanted to blaze my own trail, and I didn't get into the school I really wanted to go to. And so I got into my second choice. And so I went there. That was Monmouth University in New Jersey. And when I went there, I absolutely hated it.
mm,
At that time, Monmouth, and it still might be this way, I don't know, but it was a commuter school. There were a lot of local Ocean County kids and Monmouth County kids that would go there, and then on the weekends, everybody was 15, 20 minutes from home. They
yeah.
would go home for the weekends, and it was like campus was a ghost town. And I found myself visiting my high school friends at their colleges. And so
Mm,
a weekend in Boston, a weekend in Scranton, and a weekend in Villanova became my 3-week tour visiting my friends, because I certainly didn't want to go home. And after doing that my freshman year, I realized I loved Villanova, and I made some friends there. And I decided my sophomore year to transfer, and so now I'm at Villanova as a business major my sophomore year.
mm.
And Villanova was great. I have lifelong friends to today that I met there.
And you're thinking, okay, business degree, so I'm going to what? Go into the family business, which is real estate, or do something. At this point, you're going to be a successful businessman. What were the plans? What did life look like for you at that point?
I wasn't exactly sure what area of business. I think as a rowdy teenager, I think I always knew that I was not going to work for someone. I think I always saw myself as my own boss, to be an entrepreneur. That was kind of in my DNA. And
Mhm.
so going into our family real estate business was always an option. Wasn't necessarily my first choice. I didn't know if I wanted to be an architect or something in the construction field, but I knew that on some level, I was going to, again, blaze my own trail, do my own thing. So I went for business management. That's what my degree is, from Villanova Business Management, because I figured I was going to be in charge of something somewhere, although undefined at that time.
So we're going to get to in a moment the switch over here. Eventually, you get married and all these other things, and then the switch over to becoming a pastor. But one of the themes of this that I believe is so important is how you define yourself. And we're talking about a young boy who really you didn't even have a chance to define yourself differently because, while you have probably a few memories of what it was to have two functioning arms, really being that young, it was what you knew. And the world could define you a certain way. Your parents could have defined you a certain way. You could have defined yourself a certain way. When you went to college where you were meeting new people, they could define you a certain way. Talk about the way you define yourself and why the concept of what we choose to define ourselves as is so powerful.
Well, your name is the great example. You're Elizabeth. I call you Elizabeth, and it's because that's how you introduced yourself to me. Hi, this is Elizabeth Nader.
Right.
You didn't introduce yourself as Liz or Beth. How you present yourself to the world is how they are going to respond to you. And so you presented yourself to me. This is Elizabeth Nader. Well, you're Elizabeth, and that's what I call you. So I presented myself as a leader, somebody who, in my personality, I would obviously be able to say that I am an alpha. I have been given a lot of leadership roles. I know I have a big personality, and when you just present that, that's how people see you, and
Mm.
that's how they respond. And when you come across other alphas, you start to headbutt. But most people are looking for people to lead them, and so it's just been an amazing life to watch that, from being a football captain as a high school senior, to being the head of my home with a wife and four children, to owning my own business and being a pastor. Those are all leadership roles because
Mhm.
that's what you put out, and that's how people see you when you put that forward.
And nothing you just said has anything to do with your deficiency, which other people would call it that, right? Whatever challenges you had, we all have them. Yours just happens to be one that people can see. And in no way did you use that to define yourself. But would people try to define you that way? Would they be uncomfortable? Would you sense that they were uncomfortable? Did you feel like you needed to overperform to make them feel different? When they met you, what usually would the reaction be?
No, I would think, it's a physical characteristic, really, and
Mm,
I'm not even trying to downplay it. When you meet somebody and you have to describe them to somebody, 6 foot, brown hair, skinny.
yeah.
That those are defining characteristics. With me, the guy with one arm. I mean, it's just a, a physical characteristic that helps be an identifier, and so I do have an identifying characteristic, but it is not something that defines Philip, who he is and what he represents. When I die, I don't want to be the guy with one arm.
Yeah.
When I die, I want to be the guy who loved people, that was passionate for the Lord, who was a
Mm,
preacher. He was a family man. Though there's identifying characteristics that are in your eulogy. I don't know if one arm is going to be in my eulogy. I really don't. So
no.
that's how we live our lives.
Yeah.
How what do we want our eulogizer to say? And
Right.
I don't want them to talk about my arm. I want them to
Right.
talk about
Right.
others, more significant things.
Absolutely. So now let's go to sort of post college, and you're still not I don't know exactly the timing you're going to tell us, but you're still not really walking with God. Still haven't established that relationship with him that he's probably wooing you. You have to have. You cannot never really run from it, right? We try hard sometimes, don't we? But he always runs after us. So tell us about end of college, post college, when Jen comes onto the scene. Kind of walk us through how somehow through all of this you end up becoming a pastor.
Well, my senior year of college was really, I call it a pin drop in my journey to being a pastor. It was my senior year of Villanova. I came home to my parents' house, and when I came into the garage door, it comes in quickly into the kitchen, and who's having lunch? But my parents and their pastor. And they didn't know I was coming home. I didn't know they were going to be there. And I sat down with them, and after lunch, they were cleaning up, and the pastor said to me, he said, "Philip, do you mind if I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure, pastor, what's up?" And he said, "If you died today, are you 100% certain where you'd spend eternity, or do you have some doubt?" We mentioned that I was raised in a Christian home. I have never been put in such a narrow point
Hmm.
of self reflection than
Yeah.
in that moment. And the way he asked that question, it stopped me dead in my tracks. And I didn't have my friends around. I didn't have to come up with any quick witted answer and be a wise guy. It stopped me dead in my tracks, and I thought about it for a few seconds, and I said, "Well, pastor, I think I know where I'd spend eternity, but I hope I'm wrong."
Mm,
Because as I said earlier, when I went to college, I knew that I was moving further away than the way I was raised because I didn't have that parental oversight. So even though my relationship with God was not personal, I had enough head knowledge to know that I was going in the wrong direction.
yeah.
And when he asked me that and made it eternal,
Mm,
I was, he derailed me right there on the spot.
mm,
And he said, "Okay, that's a very honest answer." He said, "Do you mind if I share some Bible verses with you?" I said, "Sure." He took me what's called the Romans Road. It's about 4 or 5 Bible verses. And he took his time. He explained them and wouldn't go on to the next Bible verse until I said I understood what he was talking about. And when we were all done, he said, "All right, you said you thought you knew where you'd go when you died, but you hoped you were wrong." He said,
mm,
"Now that we've looked at the scriptures, according to the Bible, where would you go when you die?" I said, "I'd go
mm,
to hell." And he said, "Okay." And he brought me to that decision to Christ. And in that decision, I said no. And it was because I was preparing my senior year to head off to spring break. And I knew God was going to change my life. And I knew
mm,
God was going to do a miracle in my heart. I knew that much. And I wasn't going to have God perform a miracle in my heart and then go live like the old person for
mm.
spring break. And I
Yeah.
wasn't going to cancel my trip either. It was coming up in about 72 hours. And there's looking back at that, that was one of the most foolish decisions I've ever made in my entire life. Really gambling, literally gambling with my eternity. But there's a Bible verse that talks about the man who's holden with the cords of his iniquity. And
Mm,
really, I loved my sin. And in that moment, I was not prepared to give up my sin.
mm,
And so at 21 and a half years old, I knew my eternal destiny based on that conversation I had with the pastor at lunch. And I still said no. And
wow.
my spring break was awful. I still went, and it was awful because I couldn't get those Bible verses out of my mind and out of my heart. And so
Mm,
I graduate Villanova, and life is continuing on. And then August 15th, the year 2000. It's coming up on my 21-year anniversary,
mm,
where I really gave my heart to the Lord. In my moment, again, we talked about perception, how strong perception is. What people would look at me. I'm a Villanova grad. I'm involved in my family real estate business. I'm making money. And internally, I felt like my life was spiraling out of control.
mm,
And you never know what somebody's going through
right.
privately in their life. And in my despair, I asked the Lord to save me, and I gave my heart to Christ. And my prayer was this: around 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, August 15th, the year 2000. God, I've lived my life my own way for 23 years. If you let me live another 23 years, I promise to live them for you. That was when my heart changed. That's repentance.
Wow.
That's what the Bible talks about, repenting. My heart turned from everything Philip wanted and everything that I desired and everything I was going after. My heart turned to the Lord, and I had to get that straightened out first. And so August 15th, I'll be saved 21 years.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, you told him, you give me another 23. I think you should have asked for a few more though. Now I'm
Yeah, yeah, I'll renege on that prayer just a little bit. We'll take it year by year after that. It's like, after you fulfill your lease, your
yeah.
1 year lease, you go month to month after that. I will go year to year on that. But
Oh,
certainly,
yeah.
I hope that in a general sense, I've certainly kept up my end of the
Right.
bargain with the Lord.
Right. Right. So that's awesome. So you went sort of around the world to finally come back home, and I'm sure your parents were absolutely thrilled to see you finally break through that, whatever had been holding you back. And then you met Jen. You met Jennifer at some point, who is an incredible woman. Where did you meet her?
We met. We were working for the same business. It was actually before that moment when I became a Christian. We knew each other. We had dated, and we were actually broken up at the time. And so that was a little bit part of my downward spiral.
Mm,
Not being able to keep a girlfriend and not being able to be the leader in a relationship the way that I would want to. And so we were actually broken up at the time. And when I became a Christian, we had remained friends. And then, I immediately began inviting her to church because I certainly cared about her and wanted her to understand what God had done for her the same way I had realized it. Now, I was raised in it.
right.
She wasn't. And I wanted her to know those Bible truths desperately. And so would invite her to church, and she ended up making a profession of faith, and our relationship began to grow around church, and then we ended up getting married.
That's the best way to do it. And 4 kids later. But in all of this comes Pastor Phil. Now, Jen will say, I don't remember signing up for that part of it. And so that was a bit of a surprise, maybe to her, an evolution she wasn't expecting. How did the pastor thing come around?
Well, we were faithfully attending church, and then we got engaged, and then we got married, and then we had 3 children, and then we adopted a fourth child. And so now we're living in our home, and business is thriving, and we are serving in our church. And then I knew the Lord had called me to preach back in 2009. And she knew that I loved teaching the Bible. I worked with the youth in our church, and when I knew God called me to preach, that was a game changer. Obviously, the call of God on your life to preach the Bible, that changes things, as well it should. And I didn't know in what way I was going to fulfill that call. The Bible says that the gift and call of God is without repentance, and so God doesn't change His mind when He calls someone to preach. And so I knew that this was going to be a lifelong vocation, preaching. But there's a lot of different ways you could preach. You could preach
Right.
as a pastor. You could preach as an evangelist, a missionary, a youth pastor. You could preach as an assistant pastor. But there's a lot of different ways to exercise that gift and that calling. And I wasn't sure what it was for me. But through prayer, about a year and a half later, we knew that we were supposed to start a church in Hoboken, New Jersey, home of Frank Sinatra, the
Mhm.
first baseball game in history, and most recently, the Cake Boss. And so, 1 square mile town has a rich history. And we started a church there when I knew God was going to have us start a church and pastor a church. I went back to school and got my master's degree in pastoral theology in Connecticut. And we moved up there for 2 years, came back and started our first church in 2012. And yeah, Jen married a real estate guy and ended up being a pastor's wife who played the piano.
Well, we can't stop there because that's not all she ended up getting as part of this deal, right? And the pastor thing, of course, that in itself continues in some way. We'll see where that goes. Starting churches, which is an entrepreneurial thing to do. It fits who you are. It fits the leader in you and all of that. But it wasn't the even nearly the end of the story. And of course, things are still evolving. But let's kind of fast forward, because this life and all these things you've overcome, and all the changes that you probably couldn't have anticipated, now all of a sudden you find yourself running for governor in New Jersey. How does that happen?
Well, my wife and I, we had a conversation, and it was in my kitchen in our home. And we have this kitchen island, and it's a large center island where we do all of our entertaining. And I was explaining to her, I feel like the island represented my life influence. Third generation real estate developer. I didn't start our real estate company. My grandfather did. My dad grew it. And now I'm involved in it. I am riding the coattails of the blessings of our business. And I work really hard. But again, I didn't start it and I didn't grow it. But
Mm,
I recognize the business influence that we have around the state. Obviously, I shared the story of how I came to know the Lord and became a Christian by trusting Christ as my Savior. Anything that I've accomplished in ministry, from starting a church in Hoboken in 2012 to starting a second church 15 minutes up the road in 2019, being part of fundraising and raising over $1 million to start churches through the Northeast. That's influence. And
yeah.
through all of that, I felt like there was more influence that I had that I wasn't actually stewarding. And there's truths in the Bible about the one with 5 talents, the one with 2 talents, and the one with 1 talent. And,
Hmm.
and really, our job is to do what we're supposed to do with what God has given us. And it
Yes.
doesn't matter if you have 1 talent, 2 talent, or 5 talents, you're supposed to exercise all of those talents.
Yes.
And I did not feel, even with some of those accomplishments, that I was exercising all of my talents. And I took my cell phone out of my pocket, and my cell phone placed on the kitchen island was very small. And I said, I
Hmm.
feel like the island represented my talent, my life's talent and influence that God has given me. None of it's mine. It's either family, which is a blessing of God, or it's ministry, which of course is a blessing of God. But what I was stewarding was only the size of my cell phone.
Mm,
And for 2 years, we prayed about it before we launched our campaign to run for governor. And what a journey that 2 years was. All the time I'm pastoring, we started a second church, but we were praying about what God had for us. And it was really, we were narrowing in on running for governor. We had been praying for it, and really, it was the icing on the cake, the whipped cream, and the cherry on top was when Phil Murphy closed the state
yeah.
and deemed my church and the entire faith community of New Jersey non-essential.
Mm,
Doors closed, locked, bolted
right.
shut. And that was where I knew the time was now, and somebody needed to challenge this situation, because I believe we're to obey God rather than man. That's in the scriptures. And so I knew that if somebody did not challenge our current governor, I've said in a video, I'm stepping away from my pulpit in order to save my pulpit.
Right. Right.
And I genuinely believe that. And I believe that to right now,
Yeah.
to this 100th milestone podcast. I believe it right up to this moment where the faith community in New Jersey is in deep, deep trouble under Phil
Yes.
Murphy. And this fall, coming into this winter, is going to be really interesting. But I'll tell you this, I absolutely refused to close our church under the first lockdown. You heard it here first. I will die before I ever close our ministry because a government official tells us to. We will continue to have our church opened and serving our community, but really that was the really the final straw where I knew somebody had to step up and challenge Phil Murphy for really his position against New Jersey families.
Well, it's the story is great, and it's a tremendous story about understanding influence and God's call and what he gives each of us. And like you said, the parable of the talents. Actually, you remind me of part of my book. I talk about metron, and that word is used once in the Bible by Paul, and it's about your sphere of influence. And he says not to actually act outside of your metron, that we want to act within it. And when we are faithful to do that, God then increases our sphere of influence. And in any situation, whether you're serving, well, you're always serving people, but whether you're doing that in the capacity of a business or as a pastor or as an elected official, the way that you experience success in life is to serve more people, right? I mean, a business gets more customers, that's success. A pastor grows a church or following or plants more churches, that's a success. An elected official wins an election and can achieve things, that's success. And so you're growing and you're serving more people. But if you're not growing your sphere of influence and you're really not chasing purpose. And so your life it's an interesting story. And the reason I wanted to tell it is because no matter who is listening right now and no matter what God has gifted them with, everyone has that call to increase their metron, to increase their sphere of influence, to serve well within what we have today, not to step outside of it until he grows it, and to listen to that leading and know what the timing is. Now, the definition of success is not always winning at something. It's really the definition of success is what you have told me before. And I love what you say about this.
Yeah, my pastor up in Connecticut, where I did our ministry training, success is defined this way: success is the extent of control that God has in a person's life. That
I
is
love that.
success. It's about how yielded you are to God. That is what measures your success, by doing what He wants you to do.
That's amazing. And that really doesn't translate into what our human mind wants it to, which is, well, if I do something and it's successful by man's measure, then it was meant to be. That's actually not the case at all. In fact, some of the hardest things we do in life are the things that God intended for us to do. And sometimes we cannot see the outcome while we're here. Sometimes we do. Sometimes it is winning as defined by man. Sometimes it's not, but it's always about growing your sphere of influence. It's always about learning more about who he created you to be and being faithful to what he's given you now so that he can continue to bless you with more. So really the campaign, as we saw you run for governor this year in the primary, in a short period of time, a very short period of time from when you announced until the election, you created an incredible impact on this state. And a lot of people saw in you the opportunity to express their frustration and feel as though someone was fighting for them. And so we termed it Rizomania, but I call it a phenomena that I don't know if there isn't one candidate out there who would want to recreate that and figure out how did he do that. I want to hear what you think. I see it from the outside as an authentic person who's committed to fighting for others and telling the truth. I think people are so inherently attracted to that. They don't even have the words for it sometimes, but they know that that's what's going to change the future. How do you see the campaign and really the amazing impact you had on the state in such a short period of time?
Well, as I said, the gift and call of God is without repentance. And so I know that God called me to be a preacher. Whether I am always going to be a pastor or not, that is a different conversation. But my heart is in the ministry. And what is ministry? Ministry is serving people. And so for the last 10 years, I have been serving people. I've been ministering to people as a pastor. One of the roles of the pastor is I get to preach. And so I'm fulfilling that call to preach through the ministry of being a pastor of a church. But the government is ministry as well.
Mm-hmm.
In Genesis chapter 9, God creates government. And in the New Testament, all the way fast forward to Romans chapter 13, government officials are called the ministers of God.
Mm,
And in the first 7 verses of Romans chapter 13, it talks about being the ministers of God 3 times. And so I saw our entire campaign as something that I know God was calling me to do, something He had for me to do. to serve people as a minister of God, as an elected official. Now, I'll always be a preacher. Will
Yeah,
I always be a pastor? Well, I was prepared not to be if I won the
right.
primary and then, took the office of governor. I was prepared not to pastor, but I'll always be a preacher and I'll always be a minister because it's not about me. It's about serving people because
Mm,
that's what God's called me to do. And right in the scriptures, it lets us know that the government is ordained of God and we are the ministers of God. Now, what has happened, unfortunately, in America, a lot of Christians and a lot of people of faith have said, politics is dirty. I don't need that headache in my life. And they've
mhm.
walked away. Well, we've basically turned over our government to the ungodly.
Yeah,
And, that's what caught everybody in New Jersey in this very tough situation with the lockdowns. When the governor says you have to close your doors, pastors are saying, well, we have to close our doors because they're the ministers of God. Romans 13 says that. That
mm,
is not what Romans 13 says. We have turned over our government to the ungodly. And I believe that we need more people of faith involved in government. And that was our objective. And to really, that's a long explanation to answer your question of how did all of that excitement, how did all that energy happen?
yeah,
I just treated it like it was ministry. It's a
yeah,
different office. I
right,
was going from pastor to governor, but it both are called the ministers of God. And so I
right.
went at it with the same passion as we did to successfully start two churches that people got on board with that. It was a miracle.
It really is interesting to look back and see that if you're to stand outside of it and analyze it. I think it's fascinating. And you're right in saying that God has a part in all of this. In fact, Proverbs 29:2, as you know, says that when the godly are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked are in power, they groan. Different versions of that, but it does speak to the people that are in authority over us and whether or not they are righteous. And so this phenomena happens, this campaign, which turns in a result of you coming in probably the most difficult position you could come in, which was number two. And the reason for that is that there is definitely what they would call political capital. I say it's a mandate to continue in some way, where people said we need this voice, and they saw the fighter in you, and they saw what they could not do on their own, which was to voice how they feel about what's happening in their businesses and their families and their state. So you're continuing. You feel burdened, maybe in a good way, or you feel challenged to continue to use that voice. It's even louder than it was. Tell us about what you feel now.
Well, as I mentioned that day in the kitchen with Jennifer, talking about the island representing my influence and my life influence, but I felt like I was stewarding only the size of the cell phone. Well, now we're on the backside of the campaign. That conversation was 2.5 years ago, and I believe God has answered our prayers to help us figure out how to steward all of that influence.
Mm,
And here we are.
yeah,
God does not just hand that to you. He wants to prove you. He wants to make sure you're able to
right.
handle the influence that he's given. And I believe that God trusted me with it, which is why I had it. I just didn't know how to exercise it. And that was another 2 year journey.
Mm,
And post campaign, I'm saying, okay, Lord, now I know how to steward this influence. You've made it
yeah.
abundantly clear. And that is what we're doing now, stewarding the influence that was represented by the kitchen island. The cell phone now is the same size as the island.
Yeah.
And now I know how to steward that influence. And I'm so thankful. Well, me dummy that I am, it took me 2 years to figure it out, but now I got it right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And God has all the time in the world,
Right.
and it's been phenomenal. And here we are saying, okay, this is how we're going to steward this influence now.
Right, right. And who knows, right? I mean, the future is wide open to what could happen with that. And I think a lot of people, continue to be inspired by your voice and are hoping that you will continue to use that influence in a way that will change life even for them. So as we wrap this up, I want you just to speak to that person listening right now who's heard your life story. They've got their own challenges. They feel defined by those challenges. They feel like they can't overcome them. Maybe they've had recent failures in their life that they are just being stopped by those failures, or they don't understand what God is doing. What would you say to someone who's feeling a little desperate or down right now about things in their life that aren't just the way they wanted them to be?
Well, as we talked about my life, there's certainly a lot of aspects of my life, but the one that I hold really dearest to my heart is the fact that God would call me to preach, and that calling never goes away. And so, if I could encourage anybody in any way that's dealing with a situation, dealing with a trial or a tribulation, I always go back to John chapter number 9, and in John chapter number 9, there's a man who's born blind, and he has dealt with it his whole entire life. And his disciples are asking him, why is this guy born blind? Obviously something had to go wrong. Whose sin caused
Mm,
this guy to be blind? His own? Did God know that he was going to be such a sinner that he prejudged him from birth? Or is it something that his parents did? And the Lord answered them and said, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. And so, why did a lolly column fall on a 4-year-old's arm? Was it for my sin or because of my parents' sins? It
mm,
wasn't for anybody's sins. It was for the glory of God.
mm.
And here I am on this call with you. I am a recognizable figure in New Jersey. Why? Because I'm the guy with one arm.
Yeah,
And that brings glory to God. And not everybody is going to have such an obvious trial or tribulation, but
right.
whatever it is, understand that God has put it there and allowed it for
Mm,
a reason. And if a person is not a Christian who's listening to this, the reason that thing is there is for you to come to him. And
mm,
that thing that pains you can only be healed by the Lord. And if
yeah,
there's a Christian who's listening to this and they're already saved and they have this thing in their life, God wants to be glorified in your victory over it. And some of those both play into my life, pre Christian, post Christian. But either way, why do we have these things in our lives? It's so that the works of God could be manifest in our lives. And God has great things for you, regardless of what you're dealing with, regardless of what you're struggling with. Give that thing to the Lord. If you're not saved, turn to Christ. If you are saved, well, give everything to Christ anyway.
yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. You still have to every day, right? You still have to look at things correctly because we don't stop having challenges. While we're here, we'll continue to have them. It's such a great story, Phil. I appreciate you so much for coming on and telling us all of that. And we're going to continue to watch and see what happens in your life. I mean, it's a tale that is not yet fully told. What do you think will happen in the next few years? Do you have any sense?
well, I've been asked that question a number of times, and so I this is the political answer, but it happens to be the truth. I have not committed to anything, and I'm not ruling anything out. And it sounds like such a politician answer, and it is, but it's true. And
Right.
my wife can attest to it. Hey, I married a builder. Now I'm a pastor's wife. Now I'm playing the piano. Now I'm a gubernatorial candidate's wife. Like, really, I am just willing to follow the Lord, and
Yeah.
whatever that looks like, that's what I want to do because I want my life to be yielded to Him.
Yeah.
Success, right? The
Yeah.
extent of God's control in a man's life.
I love that. I love that. Great definition of success. And also, success is not allowing the things that happen to you to define you. You choose how to define yourself within what God created you to be. And that's our journey, is to figure it out, is to figure out what He put inside of us, what gifts are there, turn them into talents, chase your purpose, and experience your destiny. So, Phil, thank you so much. This has been awesome. This will live out on the internet forever. So, if you're running for president someday, somebody will play this interview. So, I know.
You'll have to run that by Jennifer. It's
Okay.
certainly not something I'm thinking about, but I am sure she is planning on pumping the brakes on that.
I'm sure she is. Well, whatever you do, we know that it will be what you're meant to do. So it's going to be fun to watch it all happen. Thank you again for coming on, Phil. We appreciate it.
I'm honored. Thank you so much for sharing me with your audience.
All right, guys, we will talk to you next week. Have a good week.
Thank you for listening to Master Your Mindset Radio. Before you go, please visit elizabethnader.com to learn more about the Mindset Maven and how she is guiding high performers to map their mindset to their message so they can effectively express who they are and why their ideas should win. Looking forward to seeing you online.